The sea was glass. August 13th, 2025, dawned over the South China Sea with a deceptive tranquility, the sun painting the horizon in strokes of soft orange and violet. On the bridge of the USS Higgins, Commander Elias Vance held a lukewarm mug of coffee, the bitter taste a familiar anchor in the shifting currents of his world. Below his feet, 9,200 tons of American steel cut through the water with a quiet, confident hum. A routine freedom of navigation patrol. A FONOP. The acronym was sterile, bureaucratic. It did nothing to capture the feeling of sailing a warship through the most contested waters on the planet. "Anything on the scope, Lieutenant?" Vance asked, his voice low and even. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, the officer of the deck, didn't look up from her screen. "Same as the last hour, sir. Commercial traffic heavy in the lanes. A few dozen fishing contacts scattered around Scarborough Shoal. Nothing military. Keep me posted." Vance took another sip. The calm always felt temporary out here, like the breath held before a plunge. He could see the Filipino fishing boats through his binoculars, small wooden bancas bobbing on the swell. They were dots of life in a vast, empty expanse, men trying to pull a living from the water their fathers and grandfathers had fished for generations. A flicker of movement caught his eye, larger silhouettes shadowing the smaller boats. Chinese Coast Guard. Again, he felt the familiar tightening in his gut. "Sir, we have new contacts." Jenkins' voice was suddenly sharp, pulling him from his thoughts. "Multiple high-speed surface tracks bearing 310, vectoring directly for us. Designations popping up now, PLA Navy." The calm shattered. On the main tactical display, red icons bloomed out of the haze, closing fast. 2 Type 052D destroyers and a pair of Type 054A frigates. The sharp edge of China's naval ambitions rendered in digital symbols. "General quarters," Vance said, his voice losing none of its steadiness. He placed the mug down with a deliberate click. The quiet hum of the ship was replaced by the urgent metallic clang of the alarm. "All hands to battle stations." Down on the main deck, Petty Officer 3rd Class Ben Miller was running a systems check on the forward Phalanx CIWS when the alarm blared. His heart hammered against his ribs, a Pavlovian response drilled into him by 1,000 exercises. He and his team moved with fluid precision, the controlled chaos of a crew trained for the worst. He snapped the final latches into place and took his station, gripping a steel railing as the Higgins maintained its unyielding course. Through the haze, he saw them. Gray hulls, lean and predatory, slicing through the waves. They didn't look like images from an intelligence briefing anymore. They were real, solid, and impossibly close. Miller could feel the vibration of their engines through the soles of his boots. The radio on the bridge crackled to life, a voice speaking English thick with static and menace. "American warship, you are in Chinese territorial waters. Leave immediately or face the consequences." Vance picked up the receiver. "PLA Navy vessel. This is United States warship USS Higgins. We are conducting routine operations in international waters in accordance with international law. We will maintain our present course and speed." He set the receiver down. The textbook response. The legal response. It felt wholly inadequate. One of the Chinese destroyers, the Changsha, surged forward. It veered sharply, its bow slicing across the Higgins path, leaving a churning white wake less than 500 yards ahead. The Higgins plowed through the disturbed water, a shudder running through its frame. It was a flagrant violation of every rule of the sea, a game of chicken played with billion-dollar warships and hundreds of human lives. Miller flinched, his knuckles white on the railing. He could see the faces of the Chinese sailors on the Changsha's deck. They were holding up their phones, recording. A cold, humiliating anger began to burn in his chest. They were being played with, taunted, while the world watched. On the bridge, the atmosphere was electric with unspoken tension. Every sailor stood ramrod straight, their faces masks of professional focus, but Vance could feel their simmering frustration. His men and women were warriors, trained to fight, to dominate. To stand here and absorb this insult, it went against every instinct. "They're boxing us in, sir," Jenkins reported, her voice tight. "The frigates are taking up positions on our port and starboard quarters. The other destroyer is shadowing our stern." They were prey, being circled. "USS Higgins, this is your final warning." The radio crackled again, the voice harsher now. "Divert your course now." Vance looked at the tactical plot, at the red icons forming a cage around his ship. He looked through the reinforced glass at the steel prow of the Changsha as it prepared to make another pass. The first act of this dangerous play was over. Now, the real test would begin. The standoff stretched into a suffocating eternity. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes like hours. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the steel decks, turning the air thick and humid. For the crew of the Higgins, the world had shrunk to this small patch of water, a pressure cooker of pride, protocol, and silent, simmering rage. Miller watched as one of the Type 054A frigates made its move. It was smaller, nimbler than the destroyers, and it used its agility with terrifying recklessness. The frigate accelerated, cutting in front of the Higgins with even less clearance than the first pass. The distance shrank to a mere 300 yards, a heartbeat, a single miscalculation, away from catastrophe. He could smell their diesel exhaust. He could see the red star on the smokestack, a splash of defiant color against the dull gray hull. The proximity alarm shrieked on the bridge. "Collision alarm!" Jenkins yelled, her professional calm finally cracking. "Sir, they're not going to yield." Vance's mind worked with chilling clarity. He saw the variables in an instant, the mass of both ships, their momentum, the catastrophic rupture of steel hulls, the flash fire of thousands of gallons of marine fuel, the list, the cold, dark water. He saw the faces of his crew. He saw the headlines. "War in the Pacific." "Hold course," he ordered. His voice was a rock in the torrent of adrenaline. "Maintain speed." The order felt insane. Every instinct screamed to turn, to slow, to give way. But Vance knew that was the game. To yield was to lose. To yield was to validate their claim, to admit that this patch of international ocean belonged to them. Discipline was their only weapon and their only shield. On deck, Miller braced for impact. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, a silent prayer on his lips. The roar of the frigate's engines was deafening as it sliced past their bow, so close he felt the spray from its wake on his face. The Higgins bucked as it hit the turbulence, but it did not deviate. It did not flinch. The frigate fell back into formation, its point made. A wave of relief, so profound it was sickening, washed over Miller. It was followed by a fresh surge of fury. He looked at his shipmates. Their jaws were set, their eyes hard. The humiliation was a physical thing, a poison seeping into the air. They had the power to turn those 4 Chinese ships into little more than coordinates on a sonar map, twisted wreckage at the bottom of the sea. 96 vertical launch cells, each one a promise of overwhelming force. The Phalanx CIWS at his own station could spit a wall of tungsten at 4,500 rounds per minute. And they were ordered to do nothing. Vance watched the scene unfold, his own hands clenched into fists at his side. He thought of the nearly $2 billion price tag of his ship. He thought of the flag stitched onto the sleeve of his uniform. This wasn't just a naval confrontation. It was a deep, personal insult. Yet he knew the razor's edge he walked. One order, one armed missile, one elevated gun barrel, and he could become the man who started World War III. That burden was heavier than the 9,200 tons of steel beneath his boots. He raised his binoculars again, panning away from the warships toward the shoal. The drama there was of a different kind, but no less brutal. The Chinese Coast Guard cutters were now openly tormenting the Filipino fishing boats. High-pressure water cannons tore across the small wooden vessels, blasting with enough force to shatter windows and shred nets. One of the cutters, a 2,000-ton behemoth, deliberately rammed a 50-foot banca, the sickening crunch of wood and fiberglass carrying faintly across the water. The small boat spun, nearly capsizing as its crew scrambled to stay aboard. "Sir," "Are we just going to watch this?" Jenkins asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusation. It was the question everyone on the bridge, everyone on the decks, was asking. Vance saw it all through the powerful lenses. He saw the Filipino fishermen, their faces contorted in fear and disbelief, retreating from their own ancestral fishing grounds. They were being chased away like vermin. And here he was, commanding one of the most powerful warships ever built, a silent, impotent witness. His mission was to demonstrate presence, to uphold the law. But what good was the law when it was being so savagely mocked right before his eyes, and his only response was to endure? The Chinese radio operator started taunting them. It wasn't an official warning now, but a stream of insults in broken English. They called them cowards, paper tigers. They asked if they were lost. The rage on the Higgins became a palpable force. It was in the tightened grip of the helmsman, the white knuckles of the radar operator, the rigid posture of every sailor. They knew their ship's systems were tracking every single contact, from the warships to the planes overhead to the submarines that might be lurking unseen below. The Aegis combat system was a god's-eye view of the battlefield, a web of data that promised total dominance. They knew that if the order came, the one word, execute, the fight would be over in minutes. The Chinese ships, for all their bluster, would be annihilated before they could even get a missile off. The Chinese knew it too. This wasn't a military operation for them. It was a performance. It was psychological theater for an audience back home and for the smaller nations watching across the region. Their goal wasn't to sink the Higgins, but to humiliate it. To create footage of an American destroyer being pushed around, proving that the giants could be made to bend. Vance lowered his binoculars. Restraint was not weakness, he told himself, repeating the mantra of his training. It was control. It was the highest form of discipline. But as he watched a Filipino family's livelihood get torn to shreds by a water cannon, it felt an awful lot like failure. The tension had reached its peak. The physical threat of collision had passed, but the deeper, more corrosive psychological battle was at its most intense. The world held its breath and waited. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the water, the dynamic shifted. The Chinese flotilla, having performed for their cameras for hours, began to disengage. It wasn't a retreat. It was a slow, arrogant pivot, a final, contemptuous dismissal. One by one, the destroyers and frigates turned, their wakes carving lazy arcs in the water as they moved off toward the horizon, their gray silhouettes eventually melting back into the haze from which they had emerged. The cage was gone. Silence descended upon the bridge of the USS Higgins. It was a heavy, ringing silence, filled with the ghosts of shouted orders and blaring alarms. The tension didn't evaporate, it congealed, leaving a residue of exhaustion and quiet fury. The ship continued on its course, a lone steel island in a suddenly empty sea. Vance finally allowed his shoulders to slump, just for a second, before straightening again. He knew what his crew was feeling. He felt it himself, a bitter cocktail of relief and profound dishonor. He keyed the ship-wide intercom, the 1MC. His voice, calm and measured, filled every compartment of the vessel, from the engine room to the missile bays. "All hands, this is the captain." He paused, choosing his words with care. "What you did today was one of the hardest things I will ever ask of you. You stood your post with unwavering discipline in the face of direct, reckless provocation. Every one of you wanted to fight back. It's what you're trained to do. It's who we are." On the deck, Miller leaned against the cool steel of the CIWS, listening to the captain's voice crackle from the speakers above. "But today," Vance continued, "strength wasn't measured by the missiles we could have fired. It was measured by the discipline that kept them in their tubes. The ships that harassed us wanted a reaction. They wanted a justification. They wanted to film an American warship firing the first shot. You denied them that. You held the line. You upheld the law when it was being mocked, and you showed the world the difference between a professional navy and a band of bullies. I am proud of every single one of you. Stand down from general quarters. The watch is relieved. The announcement ended. The order was given. But the feeling remained. As Miller helped secure his station, he looked out towards Scarborough Shoal. The Chinese Coast Guard cutters were gone too, leaving the Filipino fishermen to tend to their battered boats and ruined nets. He could see them pulling debris from the water, trying to salvage what they could of their morning's work, of their livelihood. The USS Higgins had won the strategic battle. They had completed their faux op. They had refused to be baited into a catastrophic war. But looking at those small wooden boats, Miller felt a profound sense of loss. They had held the line of international law, but that line felt very far away from the men who had to live and work and feed their families in these waters. As dusk settled, the Higgins sailed on, a silent sentinel resuming its lonely patrol. The sea was glass once more, the surface hiding the immense tension and violence that had churned just beneath it. Commander Vance stood on the bridge wing, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon. They hadn't fired a shot, but the confrontation had left its own kind of shrapnel, in the hearts of his crew and in the fragile peace of this contested sea. The silence was more telling than the roar of any battle. It was the sound of a new kind of conflict, where victory was measured not in what you destroyed, but in what you chose, with agonizing restraint not to. The lesson, in the silence. What we witnessed aboard the USS Higgins is a stark illustration of power in the 21st century. True strength is no longer simply about possessing the largest arsenal, it's about having the wisdom and discipline to know when not to use it. The crew's restraint in the face of humiliation was not an act of weakness, but a demonstration of incredible control. They understood that the cost of firing that first shot would be immeasurably greater than the sting of a momentary insult. They chose to bear the burden of peace, even when every instinct screamed for war. This story reminds us that in a world bristling with advanced weaponry, the most powerful force we possess is often our own patience and our commitment to a lawful order, even when that commitment is tested in the most painful ways. What would you have done if you were in Commander Vance's shoes? Was this an act of strength or a sign of weakness? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you value in-depth stories that explore the complexities of our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel.